Today's just an excuse for me to play my music.
Yeah, that's right.
Just dump the microphone in my tea. Right. Is this on? Yeah, no. Indie man. Is it on or not? Right. I have no idea whether this microphone is on or not. No. Strange? Okay, I'm just going to go. Can you hear me at the back without this mic? Just. Okay. AV man. Microphone, please. Go on. Hello, in the box. "No, Luke, I am your father." Right, has everybody... God, that's loud. Everybody cool after lunch? Nobody's kind of feeling like going to sleep? Because we've got lots to do this afternoon. As I kind of hinted at the beginning, I haven't done this particular workshop before, or done a run-through. So I have no idea whether or not we're going to finish or fit everything in. So it could be that we kind of dip in and out of various things this afternoon, but I'll try to get as much done as possible. And I kind of lost half an hour, because I thought we were going to finish at 5:30, but apparently we're going to finish at 5. So providing that the venue doesn't kick us out, I'd quite like to go to 5:30, just to try to get as much in as possible. So I'm not being paid by the hour, so that's okay. This is where we got to, and really I think the essence of what we were talking about earlier on was the fact that we should be using markup very minimally and appropriately, and then using CSS to do all the cool visual stuff that we want to do to accomplish the designs that we have. And I thought it was very good, the question about the columns earlier on, because that really summed it up for me, in terms of the fact that the columns are not there in the markup. The columns are there because of CSS, which is exactly what the job of CSS is, which is to produce the rich visual interface that we want to create. And hopefully we can remember some of these, what we used to term advanced selectors. So I'm going to pick up where we left off, because all of this stuff is foundation to some of the cool CSS trickery that you'll see in a minute. So really here it's a question of saying, okay, I don't want to add a specifically presentational attribute into my markup to, let's say, remove the last vertical bar, when I can use the job of CSS appropriately to do that, and use, in this particular case, a pseudo element or a last child selector. Now, a pseudo element is really an element which is not there essentially to be able to be targeted within the DOM. So if we think about the document object model, and we think about the fact that every element that we have becomes a node in that document object, we're able to generally style an element based on its place within the markup, or the node, or its node within the document. Yes?
I think your changes still come through.
Oh, is it? No, I think iTunes is off, isn't it? I can't get used to this jaw thing. No, it's off. Oh God, it's country and western. No, I know. AV guy, stretch, if we can lose that other music, that'd be great. It's definitely coming through, isn't it? I'll try and figure out what's going on with that, but it's my iTunes isn't going. Oh, yes it is. Oh.
And it's country and western.
Oh no, it's... Oh, you found me out. It's actually Ian Jury and the Blockheads. It's gone, isn't it? Okay, I'll take it all back. So let's have a look at some other examples of that. Let's have a think about the fact that we want to potentially draw attention to, in this case, the first line of any paragraph. So that doesn't exist. The first line isn't an actual element or node within the document object that we're able to target specifically. That there isn't a first line node. So CSS and the pseudo element enables us to create a pseudo first line. So here, for example, we're saying, right, I want to take the first line of every paragraph, increase its font size and make it bold. So you can see that the first line of that particular paragraph is styled slightly differently. Now, this is a particularly interesting type of pseudo element, because what constitutes the first line? That's going to vary, isn't it? It's going to vary according to the width of the browser window or the size of the element that contains it. Also, maybe the text size as well. So if we increase the size of the text, we have fewer words, fewer letters that fall onto that first line. So it's only what happens to appear, what the browser calculates to appear on that first line, which is going to pick up the styling. So you can see there, if we reduce the width quite considerably, we now only have 6 words. Six words on that first line. So the browser itself is calculating exactly what's going to appear. Now, there's no way really that you could do that with presentational markup, unless you happen to, let's say, add some form of element across what you thought was going to be the first line content. So you might put strong elements around it. But of course, that's not going to take into account increasing the text size. So you might find, if you did that, that some of the bold words might spill onto the second line. So really, this is one of the first instances where actually using one of these so-called advanced selectors actually has real advantage in giving us the ability to do something that we weren't able to do before. And again, the most important thing about this pseudo capacity is that it targets an element which is not really there inside the document. The other one which I like to use a lot is first letter. Now you see people do weird stuff. You know, they might put span around, let's say, the first letter of the first word, and do strange things with it. But again, we want to try to keep as much presentation out of the markup as possible. So here we're actually using the first letter pseudo element, styling that in a particular way, you know, making it bold and increasing the size, and we can float it and create drop caps and do all of that really nice kind of calligraphy style typographic effects that, you know, were so nice in old-fashioned kind of print designs. And again, there's very few ways in which you could really do this presentationally. And why would you want to start putting presentational attributes back into your markup? Now, of course, the problem with first line and first letter, in fact, all pseudo elements, is no support in i6. So what's the worst thing that could happen? Exactly. Is that a bad thing? We're not really conveying any meaning through the design. We're just adding a little bit of a visual twist, a bit of spin to it. So if the worst that can happen is that they don't see the drop cap, well, that's fine by me. And of course, what we can do is we can start mixing and matching all of these different selector types together in any kind of combination that we like. So for example, we might be combining child selectors with ID selectors, or we might be using descendant selectors with class or maybe even adjacent selectors. Any kind of combination of these different selectors we can do. And you will possibly end up with some pretty convoluted strings, you know, some long strings of CSS. And particularly if you try to dissect anybody else's CSS, and you think, what the bloody hell is that doing? But the easiest thing to do, there is actually a website called, I think it's Select Oracle, where you can actually type in the CSS string, and it will actually kind of read it back to you in human language. But the easiest thing to do is to actually read it. It's like learning a foreign language. Start at the end and work backwards. So here, if we take this last one, we're saying I want to style any anchors that have a title attribute, that are direct children of list items, that are also direct children of unordered lists, not ordered lists, that are inside a something that has an ID of nav main. So even the most complicated strings of CSS, you can quite easily understand if you read it back. So is everybody cool with that? Everybody know that before? Nothing new, I wouldn't have thought. So, God, we might even be catching up to be on time. So, in terms of a summary, in terms of a summary of kind of where we are, just to kind of draw everything together before we get into some crazy stuff, is that, in my mind, one of the most important things that we can do as progressive web designers and developers is to think a lot more seriously about the real fundamentals of what we're adding into the stuff that we make. Think about markup not just from a presentational point of view, so don't address it in the old-fashioned way of looking at a comp and saying, these are the divs that I need. But think about things right from the ground up, from each individual element of content right the way out. Think about microformats, if need be, if it's appropriate, which often it is. Not just to give really detailed meaning to an element, but also to enable us to add in, use them as hooks for styling later on. And rather than thinking presentationally and adding stuff into our markup just to accommodate or just to facilitate a visual result, am I feeding back here? It might be a touch loud. Rather than thinking, right, I need to then add into the document elements or attributes that allow me to accomplish a visual result, think about using selectors, all of them appropriately, whether or not they're CSS2 or CSS 2.1 or possibly even CSS3, where it's appropriate and where it's supported, to prevent us from having to add in presentational stuff into our markup and letting CSS do the job that it was designed to do, which is to produce the visual result. So that's kind of where I wanted to be at the end of lunch. And 6 minutes off, that's not bad actually. So let's look at doing some cool things. Quick refresher, just for, I think it's always worth going back over a couple of things. I'm sure everybody's been bitten by the box model at some point in the past. I want to teach my grandmother to suck eggs, but I think that it's important, again linking it back to what we said earlier, to think about the box model again and to realize that all elements generate a box when we add them into a page. It doesn't have to be divs. Every single element that we add, whether it's an inline element, an anchor, or a block level element like a paragraph or a block quotation or a heading, all of these elements that we add onto a page generate a box. And those boxes can be styled, they can be laid out, obviously depending on whether they're block or inline elements. All of the elements that we add onto a page can be styled. So the first thing that we don't have to do is to always reach for a div. And if you delve into people's markup sometimes, you'll see that there'll be an unordered list for navigation, and that unordered list is wrapped in a div, and the styling's been added to the div, not to the list. All sorts of weird stuff. If there's enough in HTML, there's enough elements and attributes there now, particularly when it comes to using microformats, for us to bind our CSS rules to. We don't always have to think about, if I want to create a layout, I have to use a div. Goes back to that contact page example from earlier on. So it is important to remember that absolutely everything that we add to a page creates a box. So if we think about this in terms of the visual model versus the CSS box model, with everything that we add to a page, every element that we add, we can add margins and padding and borders and backgrounds. Everything that we want to do can be applied to every element, not just to a div. So every element has a content area, and we can either leave things in the normal flow, or we can float them or position them. Again, it comes back to this notion that we don't have to use divs for layout. So this is another piece of W3C creative writing. which is their definition of the CSS box model. Again, I wish that sometimes they would write content that was a little bit more human readable, particularly for newcomers to CSS. But essentially, this is what we're talking about when we start adding content to a page. Every element that we add will have a content area, and surrounding that will be padding and border, and then margin between it and any other elements on the page. So how do we calculate those widths? How do we stop the box model from sneaking up behind and biting us on the bum? Well, the easiest thing to remember is that the W3C's box model is not how you imagine it to be. It's kind of a counterintuitive a little bit. And the way that we calculate the widths on any element is to take the content area and then add the padding and then the border to it, which is kind of counterintuitive because you imagine a box being, like a box. So if you have a shoebox, which is, 12 inches wide, and then you want to put something in it, you might think, well, okay, I want to protect my crown jewels with some padding, some tissue paper, so I'm going to put 4 inches of tissue paper all the way around the outside, but my box is still 12 inches wide. And that the actual width of the wall of the box might be, I don't know, a quarter of an inch or so. So you think to yourself, okay, well, but the box is still 12 inches wide. The box itself hasn't changed. I've said I wanted it 12 inches wide. No matter how thick the walls are, or how much padding I include, that's the size of the box. What happens is the content area diminishes. I've got less room to put stuff in. And that's kind of the way that we imagine often that boxes, and certainly the CSS box model, would work. But of course, in their infinite wisdom, that isn't how the W3C specifications work. So being good standards evangelists, we obviously adhere to the specification. So we can see, if we go down the W3C route, that if I have 100 pixels worth of content area, and then I have 5 pixels worth of tissue paper, padding either side, and a pixel's worth of border, actually the complete width of my box is 112 pixels. Not how we might first imagine it, but the correct way of calculating a box. Again, regardless of the element that we're applying the styling to. Of course, Microsoft, in their infinite wisdom, decided that they were early on going to introduce a completely different box model, which is the one that kind of I described, which is, on the face of it, makes a little bit more sense. I mean, I say that I want the box to be 100 pixels wide, and it is. And I take away the padding and the border from it, but it's still 100 pixels wide. Of course, the problem is that standards-aware browsers went ahead and implemented the W3C's box model, leaving IE 5 and 5.5 to do their own thing, which of course created this whole problem that we had in the early days with creating CSS layouts, because how are you going to create a pixel perfect layout across browsers with 2 completely different box models? And of course there are ways in which we got around that with things like box model hacks, etc. But I'm not going to go into those today, because now I think nowadays, I mean, I don't think I've used a box model hack in, I don't know, about 5 years or something. It's been a long, long time since I've even had to worry about this kind of issue. But there is an important reason for keeping this sort of set of slides in the talk, is that Microsoft's chime has always been, we have customers. So they weren't about to put their hands up and say, with IE, I think it was 5.5 and certainly 6, they weren't about to throw their hands up and say, okay, we're now going to change to the W3C's box model, because what about all those people that developed, with our browsers in mind, with the old broken Microsoft box model? So actually IE 6 and 7, they work on 2 different box models. And the rendering engine actually has the facility to render both box models. And there is something in the browser that will trigger whether or not the old box model is used. Anybody know what that is? The doc type. Now, I haven't purposefully gone into this today, but there are situations in which you can easily still trigger the old Microsoft box model, particularly with what became known as the doc type switch. Because intelligently, it was actually Tantek Celik and Todd Farner came up with the idea that if a document contains a doc type, and it's a modern doc type right at the top of the document, then the browsers will switch into what are called standards mode or compliance mode, at which point IE 7 and 6 will use the W3C's box model. But if there isn't a doc type there, or it's a very old doc type like HTML2, then the browser will assume that the page is being coded in very old-fashioned kind of old-fashioned code, and will then trigger the Microsoft's old broken box model. But there are ways in which you can inadvertently flip a browser into quirks mode, as it's known. And one of those is to have anything at all above the doc type in the document, particularly things like XML prologues or even a comment that will appear above the doc type will throw IE6 into quirks mode. And quite often you'll find that you're writing something. I mean, I remember doing some work where everything was perfect. You know, I'd worked for a few weeks on designs and on HTML prototypes, and I delivered to the client, you know, wonderfully semantic, perfectly cross-browsery implemented designs. And then a week later, there's a panic phone call going, it needs fixing in IE6. And of course, the CMS that they were using was throwing in something above the doc type, which was throwing IE6 into quirks mode, and bam, the whole thing was destroyed.
PHP.
Sorry?
PHP.
Do you know, I don't know what it was. It was something that I didn't
Not this situation, in general. It's PHP's always above.
I don't get involved in back-end stuff. It's far too complicated for small brains. But you know, the most complicated I got was to go view source, find there was something above the doc type, and bam, that was the problem. So it's worth bearing in mind that there are still situations, although the box model thing has kind of gone away for the most part, it's really worth bearing in mind that there are these things that can come back and bite you on the bum occasionally. And there's just a visual representation. My old cheese-loving mate John Hicks came up with this nice kind of 3D rendering of the box model. Interestingly, just to note that neither padding nor margin can have any kind of background colours. They have to be transparent. So, once we've got to the point where we're writing good markup, hopefully, and we're using CSS selectors to bind our styles into the markup that we've written. And we realize that we don't necessarily just have to style divs for making designs and layout. Then we can start thinking about using what we've got to create cool stuff. Now, a lot of the time, I think that there's a lot of conversations go on about CSS3 and we need lots of different things. We need cool stuff, and we do. But there's still a lot of stuff that we can do that's cool with the relatively small set of techniques that we already have. And we maybe need to push the boundaries a little bit. So what I want to do now is I want to run through some of the ways in which we can bring various bits and pieces together. Now, right at the beginning, remember when I looked at those box lessons and Blue Robot examples from yesteryear? It was interesting then that so much of what they were doing, in fact all of what they were doing for the most part, used positioning for layout. And somewhere along the line, somewhere in the early 90s or early noughties, we kind of stopped using positioning to create layouts and started off floating our boat. So this was what the float property was originally designed for, was to do things like this. It wasn't designed for creating column layouts. It was literally designed as a replacement for the old text-align property in HTML. So remember, you would do text-align left or right, actually in the markup. Well, the float property was originally designed for doing that. And of course, people realized then that if you applied floats and dimensions to things like divisions, then you could use them to create column layouts. And because of our understanding at the time of, or lack of understanding at the time of how to cope with some of the issues with positioning, it almost became that kind of de facto standard for producing layouts. I mean, who here uses floats on like an everyday basis? Yeah, I mean, I would have thought anybody that writes CSS puts their hand up, because it's just the way that things are done. And that's fine, as long as we're aware that there are problems that can happen with floats and that we don't necessarily have to use floats all the time. And I think that one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is going back and looking at positioning again and looking at ways in which we can make it work. So that's the sort of thing that we do often, isn't it? We take a list, back to our reviews again. Take a list, each one of these being list items, give them dimensions, 24%, 25%, whatever, and float them. So, good markup, easily done, a perfectly good way of actually producing column layouts. Notice here that what I wanted to do was to add in a little bit of margin between each of the list items. So here, I'm taking those list items and floating them, but each one, oops, come back, each one has a margin right, except again, we're using that pseudo element, the last child, just because I don't want to have any right margin on that last list item. Simple stuff. And again, there's our visual kind of representation of it. So I don't think there's any surprises there, really. That's kind of common stuff. Now, the nice thing about working with CSS is that really we're not thinking about how the visual representation needs to be translated into markup. We should be thinking about how the markup should be translated into our visual representation. So if we go from a 4-column layout and then style this slightly differently, so here we're going to be giving them a different width, a minimum height, and then a border at the bottom. Obviously we can get a completely different visual effect just from using exactly the same markup. Oh, should have closed my, my list element. So I don't think there's anything too dramatically sexy about that. But there are ways in which we can use some of the things that we've been doing before, floats as well, we'll come back to those. Things like positioning and things like use of margins to create some really, really interesting effects. And some of the stuff maybe that we don't see enough of or on a regular basis. And one of the things that I've been doing a lot more with recently are things like negative margins. Because with a lot of the values that we can use in CSS, things like margins or positioning values, we can use negative values as well as positive values. And we can, if we just think logically through the way that we build up a page, we can use these things to create some really cool effects. And with this we've got no IE6 issues whatsoever. So I wanted to make a form for this particular site. It's like a sign up, join my fan club form. But I didn't want it to look like every other form that's out there on the web. I mean, why do forms look so dull most of the time? I mean, they just didn't want to do it. I wanted to think about ways in which I could actually have this form and do something visually interesting with it. Well, everything that we need to create that in terms of markup is already there. We've got lots and lots and lots of elements. So for example, if we look at this form, the complete form, which we'll see in a moment. You've got a div, which is the introduction text inside the form. And then because I always work to XHTML strict, every element that goes inside this form is inside a field set. So we have one for the information, one for the age, one for the activity, for the transport, and then our submit area down the bottom. So the actual markup itself is very, very minimal, but it contains lots and lots of semantic goodness. So let's build this form up, and then I'll show you it in action. So first of all, I'm just going to zero out any margins and padding and give the whole thing a width. Here's the detailed markup for each of the field sets. So they all follow more or less the same pattern. So I'm deciding that I'm going to use headings inside that form rather than legends. I tend to do that quite a lot because there's a lot of issues with styling legends in forms. It's not the most appropriate thing to use a heading, but it's not the worst abuse of semantics I can do. And for every single element, I'm wrapping the input itself inside its label to give me this construct that I'm able to style in different ways. So let's just have a look at some simple ways in which we can make this work. Well, I've got two divisions on this particular example. All I'm going to do with each one, with each field set, is to give them a slightly different amount of padding. So top, right, bottom, and left, and give them each different background images to create that tile. So the padding we'll come back to in a moment because it's going to create space for something else to drop into. So when we apply the background image, it gives me a lot more space then to allow that content to sit in nicely. And do the same thing for the other field set. Drop them together, and you get that. Again, nothing too dramatically different, but interesting that we can kind of take this theme, the Scarband theme, and take it in different ways right the way through to forms. But what about these? What about these headings? I'm sure everybody's familiar with image replacement techniques of one description or another. Well, what I wanted to do, and one of the reasons for using headings rather than legends inside this particular design, is that I wanted to use transparent PNG images of these little cut-out headings to allow a little bit of the background checkerboard to come through. So that's really easy, and this is where the margins come in. Because if we go back to our markup, again, nothing particularly, well, there's nothing presentational in there whatsoever. Going back to the CSS that we did, we allowed a little bit of extra padding at the top of each div, basically varying that padding amount depending on the height and shape of this irregular heading that I wanted to add. And that ghosted image is where the heading will sit in a moment. So here, I'm actually going to use negative margins. So this heading 3 here, I'm saying, okay, I want this to be 70 pixels up from where it would normally be in the normal flow, which is going to draw everything up along with it. So you can see that sitting in there really nicely. And we don't do enough of irregular shapes. You know, everything tends to be kind of either horizontally or vertically, doesn't it? I like to see a little bit of kind of irregularity going on. But we can drop these in, use negative margins inside each one of these divs, each one of these field sets, to pull that transparent image outside of where it would normally sit, even if it's going to overlap something else. And it works really nicely. I really like it. And we can also do other stuff with forms that we wouldn't normally do. I mean, why do form elements always have to look exactly like form elements? Why can't we kind of use them to tell a story? And if you look at a lot of magazine forms, if you look at, I don't know, whether they're quizzes or sign up to join fan club forms in magazines or whatever, you'll often see that there are dotted lines around things where you fill it. Well, why can't we do that on the web and kind of extend the branding a little bit using background images or maybe borders? So you can't really see it on here, but there's actually a dotted border around there and just the bottom border on there. So my favourite method of transport is X. And in you go. So we can do different things. We don't necessarily have to stick to those normal conventions of keeping forms looking exactly like every other form on the web. So, let me just pull up that thing actually in a browser. You have to bear with me because I'm now on this. I've got to look behind me. My coordination's not what it once was. Right, there we go. So, there we go. Of course, if I turn off CSS, I'm just going to be left. Does anybody else have this same problem with Firefox on Mac? It just takes ages to invoke anything in the Web Developer toolbar. So again, we're just left with purely meaningful, accessible information. And we'll turn CSS back on. It works. Now what I like about this is how the thing scales. And we don't necessarily have to worry too much about what happens when we increase font sizes because we're just using a tiling effect for that. And it works. Oops, I suppose we can go too far. It works really nicely. So I love to use negative margins just to pull things out of the boxes. I mean, quite often, we talk about CSS sites being boxy, but there are good techniques. I mean, if we were designing something for print, often we'd have something which would be leading our eye across a page or between panels, and that's something that I'd really like to see a lot more of on the web, and there's various techniques that we can use for doing it. So that's kind of simple stuff. But it really starts to get fun when we start thinking about positioning. So how many people use positioning of some sort on a regular basis? Oh God, I might as well go home. Good. Okay. It's really hard to pitch these things, because sometimes you don't want to do stuff which is like way above a lot of people's heads, and at the same time you don't want to do stuff which is everybody knows, because then it's boring. So it's really difficult. So I mean, I rediscovered positioning a few years ago, because I've been one of those people that just left it alone and thought that everything had to be a floated layout. But the more and more I've got into it, the more I realised that positioning is absolutely essential if we're going to get away, if we're going to be able to take very, very little in terms of markup and do cool CSS things with it. So just a quick overview of the positioning types. We have static positioning, which I'm sure nobody uses, because essentially what static positioning does is nothing. It's just the normal state of an element. So the only time that you may want to use position static is to override a previously defined positioning rule. We've got relative. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. Absolute positioning and fixed positioning. And we'll look at a few different examples of this. But I think one of the problems that positioning has had, and one of the reasons why quite a few people, and certainly newcomers to CSS, tend to shy away from it a lot and use floats, is that floats are really easy to understand. I'm going to give something some dimensions, some width. I'm going to say float left, and it's going to come over here. And that's it. Whereas positioning, again, this is the W3C's fault, is it's actually quite difficult. The terminology that's used, the way that it's being described, is actually really confusing. So let's just clarify a bunch of things. Does everybody know what I talk about, what I mean when I talk about the normal flow of a document? Okay, so normal flow is its normal state. I have headings, paragraphs, and an image. And that's not positioned. This image here is sitting exactly where it's going to be inside the normal flow of the document. So, if I resize the browser window, look, Ma, no hands. If I resize the browser window and the text at the top, the number of lines increases, the image drops down, that's the normal flow of the document. The image itself is going to change in relation to that. And if I increase the size of the text, it's going to do the same thing. That's what we refer to as the normal flow of the document. So, let's think about positioning for a second. Let's first tackle relative positioning, which is perhaps one of the worst described or worst named techniques within CSS. Because the question that everybody always asks is, relative to what? So what is it, if I position an element relatively, what do I position it relative to?
So it's explicitly the last relative parent. It's positioned in the document flow.
Okay, I'm getting a few answers here. Gentleman in the middle. Yeah, did you say something?
The last relative element, the last relative parent element, or element with, sorry, parent element with positioning.
That's absolute.
I'm confused as well. Yeah, no. Back over there. Somebody did shout out the right answer, but I can't remember exactly what it was.
It's first explicitly positioned parent.
Nope, wrong.
It's relative. It's positioned in the document flow.
Whatever it's closest to.
No.
It's positioned in the document flow.
How many people use positioning and are shouting out the wrong answer? This is why I know that it's fundamental stuff, and I think it's really important just to redefine and go over some of this stuff. Think about the normal flow for a second. The image is going to stay exactly where it is in relation to the normal flow. So if I resize the window or I increase the size of the text, the image is going to change its position according to the normal flow. Relative positioning will move an image relative to where it normally sits inside the normal flow. So, for example, I've just ghosted out where that image would normally be. Here I'm going to move that image 50 pixels from its top position, 50 pixels from its left position, and that is then where it's going to appear. So, simplest way of explaining this, and change of terminology, is let's not think about it in terms of relative or absolute, or even think about it in positioning. Let's think about it in terms of offsetting. We offset an element from where it would normally be displayed in the normal flow. Now, we want to notice here that even though I've actually offset this, none of this other text in the normal flow is able to move up and occupy that space. The space that it would have been in the normal flow is still reserved. So actually what we're doing is we're visually offsetting that image. We're not changing its position in the normal flow because the normal flow is still the normal flow. We are visually offsetting it. So from now on, we're not going to call it relative positioning at all. We're going to call it visual offset positioning. And although it's longer, it makes a little more sense.
But if you use Firefox or something to detect where that image is being moved to, it has actually moved.
No,
Its top left and right, its top left position, the top left corner will be in a different position in the document flow, and then a different position in the pane.
yeah, its actual position, its visual position has changed. So Firefox is presumably going to tell you both. But the key part about this is that if I move something, if I offset something visually, the content that follows it in the normal flow cannot move up and occupy that space, because the space that it would have occupied had I not offset it at all is reserved. So its XY position is still exactly the same. So let's not call it relative positioning, let's call it relative offset positioning. And, why the hell would you want to do it? If you think about it, if you look at that example, I mean, it's not exactly going to give us many kind of creative... Sorry? Yeah, do different ways. It's not exactly going to going to give as much. But that we can use this technique for doing some cool things, I think, that will help you break designs that are out of the box. So one common use for it that I use a lot of is things like this. So we've got our reviews again, and our little kind of gravatars. And for whatever reason, when I made this slide, I gave each one of these images a class of FL for float. And that's that. So what I'm going to do is to float these to the left. So that paragraph of copy is going to wrap around the image. But then what I can do is I can then use position relative and move it, here we go, negative 15 pixels to the left-hand side. So you notice here now that this starts to break out of the box. Now, of course, what can happen is that I have a little bit too much space there. Because if I think about where those would be a moment ago, the actual border of that image is probably about here. Because the space that it would have sat in is still occupied. The other content that follows it in the normal flow can't move in and occupy that space. So I could end up with a slightly irregular looking view. So all I need to do is to then combine that technique with negative margins and use a minus amount for the right margin, which is just going to pull that content over. And then I've got a really nice flow of text and that image breaking out into the box, breaking out of the box and across the border.
Why wouldn't you just use a margin in the first place?
Because then it wouldn't have fitted my slide. You could have used negative margins for the whole thing. You could have used negative left margin and negative right margin, which is sometimes what I do. There's a very good article by Gina Bolton on SitePoint that uses exactly the same technique. But it's one of the things that I like to do sometimes is, you know how often when you get form inputs, particularly search, horizontal forms where you've got the search box and then you've got the button, and it's really hard in certain browsers to get the things to line up. Yeah? Either negative margins or relative positioning, particularly for old tired browsers, makes it really easy just to jut things around. But yeah, think of your own kind of creative ways of using this. But the key thing for me is that I like to try to think about making designs that break out of that general box structure, just to give the thing a little bit of organic kind of flow. And if you come to my thing on Thursday, I'm talking about comics, there's going to be loads of that kind of stuff. So, as well as relative positioning, we talk about absolute positioning, which is kind of a little bit easier to understand, I hope. So, back to the normal flow, and that's where we were a minute ago. So when we absolutely position something, what do we absolutely position it in relation to? Okay, top left corner of what? Or top right corner of what? Okay. Everybody's really close, but nobody's absolutely spot on. Let's have a look at this. Let's position this image. Again, I'm positioning it absolutely with a top and a left of 0. And it is positioned to the top left-hand corner, but not the top left-hand corner of the browser pane. The top left-hand corner of the root element, which is HTML. And of course we can do things with HTML. You know, we might put margins on HTML, or we might do other strange things with HTML. It's not the browser window itself, it's HTML, the root element. So whenever we position something absolutely, we're positioning it in relation to the root element of the document, which is HTML, unless one of its parents has positioning applied. So if we look at this, here, for example, I've got a div which is called contact, and this image here that I'm now positioning, I've left the CSS for this exactly the same, But because I've now positioned its containing element, this containing element, the contact div, now acts as what we call a positioning context. Now, I've added position relative to it, but notice that I haven't done any offsets. Because if I apply position relative to something, but I don't apply any offsets, what happens? It just stays where it is. But simply by applying position relative to that containing element means that now our absolutely positioned image is positioned in relation to that containing block or that positioning context and not to the root element, which is HTML. And of course this could have other positioned ancestors, but it's always going to be positioned according to its closest positioned ancestor, or in the absence of any positioned ancestor, to the root element, which is HTML. So does that clarify things a bit? Now, we've kind of left positioning alone for a long time. And there are some great things that we can do with it if we just think a little bit laterally. And that's what I like to do. I like to look at something and think, I have no idea how I'm going to build this, and then think a bit laterally. And we can have a play. So for example, that. Now, I'm not interested in this stuff that's going on at the top here. I'm only interested in this element, this area here. Bless you. So, what markup do I need to create that whole thing here? How many divs? Okay, I've got to check my own slide here. Yeah. Well, it's a heading, and it's a list. These guys over here, well, they're just part of the list, because surely these album covers kind of belong to the list of albums that they are listed down here. So if we have a look at that markup, simple stuff. Heading level 2, unordered list, and each list item, a list item for each one of these albums. So this is the key to making this thing work. I have got a div which surrounds that whole thing. And one of the reasons for doing that is to establish a positioning context. So this is one of those instances where I might have sacrificed my semantic purity, my scout badge of meaningful markup, for the purposes of being able to do this. Now, actually, if I hadn't have had this guy on board, then I might have actually been able to do the whole thing inside the list, but that's another story for another day. Each one of these list items I've given a unique ID to. Obviously, because we can't start an ID attribute, class attribute with a 0 or with a number, I've added an A in there for album. So each one of these has been given a unique ID. And then the markup for each one is really simple. So there's our ID for that particular list item. And inside there I have my heading level 3, which has an anchor. And inside that anchor is the album art image with some no out attributes. There's my description, all inside the list item. So, simple stuff. There's the list as it stands. Those are the general list items. So I've given each one a width. I've put this in specifically here, this very long rule. But I've given each one of these a list, each one of these a width, specifically. Now inside the actual list item itself, I've got a heading level 3 and a paragraph. So I've set each one of these to display in line, because I don't want them to be one on top of the other. I want to actually display them as in-line elements, because it makes the thing look funky. And here we get into some of the cool stuff, because now I can actually position each one of those images. Effectively, what I can do is I can pick it up out of its place in the normal flow, which is inside that heading, which is inside the anchor. The anchor's inside the heading. And I can literally pick that up and position it in relation to its containing element by referencing each one of the IDs that I've used. So here I'm not having to add class of this or whatever onto each particular image. Literally, I'm just using the descendant selector to pick up each of the images inside a particular list item and move them out. So obviously, if I'm turning CSS off, I'm just going to end up with all of that meaningful content in there. But I'm able to turn something which is essentially just an unordered list, a little bit of simple positioning, and do some cool things with it. Now, if I use some other states as well, I shall show you this. If I start adding in some other techniques as well, I can't see what I'm doing this way around. Right. Is this the one? Right, there we go. So this is the thing working in Firefox. Forgive my can't see behind me mouse control. But I've applied that. I've applied all the CSS that we just looked at. And here, because I've taken that image outside of its anchor, it still picks up characteristics of that anchor. So as I move my mouse over each one of the list items, over each one of the images, over on the left-hand side, it highlights the name of that album. Or I might decide that I'm going to do it the other way as well. So without any JavaScript or anything particularly clever going on, I've just been able to turn some pretty regular markup into something that has a bit of personality. And it works both ways. Now, if I click, oops, there we go. If I click on one, I'm able to change its presentation over here as well by using a target pseudo class. So here what I'm doing is I'm saying, right, when this anchor, which is the anchor here is pointing back to itself, when this particular list item is the target of that anchor, then change its presentation. And all of this other stuff still works. And there's no JavaScript or anything particularly complicated going on with that. This is what I like to do, just little challenges. How could I take something which is very little in terms of markup and then just use CSS to do stuff like this? Now, my old mate Jeremy Keith would argue that this type of behavior belongs in JavaScript and not in CSS. But he reckons that all behavior should be done in JavaScript and general presentation should be done in CSS.
Presentation as well.
I know. Well, Jeremy talks a load of rubbish most of the time, as anybody who's seen him speak would testify to. No, he's all right. So is that all of these files, by the way? There'll be a slide with the URL. There's a few things left to fix, but they're all, you can just play with them, take them down. So let's go back to this thing again. This is where we kind of started off this morning. Let's take something completely different, looking completely different, and apply similar techniques to it. I'm going to whiz through some of this. What was the markup? It was an unordered list. Each list item, one list item for each band member, and it contains some stuff. So, back to where we saw earlier on. Each list item's got class of vcard because we're microformats geeks, but for the purposes of this, each one's got a unique ID. So there's the markup. I've got a list item, heading, anchor, paragraph, and then a div, which is our microformat contact information. So let's just see that as it works. I'm going to apply position relative to the whole list to make this the positioning context for any of the position children. I'm going to style every list item with a class of vcard and just give it a width. I'm not changing anything else about that. And now I'm going to take each one of the class of photos. Now the class of photo is the big photo that we see for each person, and the div, which contains the contact information. And I'm going to absolutely position them, just in general. So that's going to be a blanket rule. And then for the actual div itself, which is this div here, I shall apply a width. And now we can start to play. Now I can give each one unique positioning coordinates based on its positioning context, i.e. the unordered list. So I'm going to position one there, there, and there. Really simple stuff. Pop it all together, and that's how we turn just that unordered list into a full page layout. Simple positioning, just establishing that list, the unordered list itself as a positioning context, and away you go. So, has anybody got any questions about that?
Are you still able to increase the amount of text in each of those items without them screwing up?
Okay, I'll show you that. Right, combination techniques as well. We put that logo image in when we were talking about micro formats earlier on. Nothing wrong in putting some floats in there as well. Ganging all these things together. And here, can't actually see it too well. Just dropping back into some selectors. Everything with a class of tel has the little telephone icon and the little email icon. And here I'm using an attribute selector. So there's the markup for that. And here we go. I'm using an attribute selector. Here, because I'm using a PNG image. What's the worst thing that can happen for IE6? They don't get the little image. Fine with me. So, let's answer your question. Oh, I'm going to end up with a bad neck. Where the hell is the cursor? Oh, it's there. Right, so that's it working in the browser. And let's see how it behaves if we start increasing the size of the text, which is roughly the same as adding more text. I can go up 3 steps before this particular one causes me a problem.
This might sound a bit weird, but what happens, like I've got a really massive screen and I don't want to end up with postage stamp in the top left corner. So what about if you want to like align it in the middle, but you don't want to sort of make everything else go like.
Well, if you've taken, let's say you've got a centered column container, I mean, if you want to go down the whole fixed width, or well, even elastic width, or yeah, if you want to go down that route, if you've got a containing element, which you've, I don't know, used margin 0 auto to center, then there's no harm in actually placing this type of stuff just right inside it.
The absolute will just stick to the containing box.
That's the reason why we added position relative to the actual list item, the list itself, to establish that as the positioning context rather than, let's say, the top left-hand corner. So there's no reason why you can't play around with different contexts. But for this particular one, I always wanted this to stick to the actual list itself. So yeah, there could be loads going on over there, or loads going on over here.
Just, I'm interested in seeing your text size smaller, because it's the relative part that's fixing the size of the container.
Well, that's about as small as Firefox wants to go.
What happens to your profile down the bottom corner there?
Hang on. Oh, what happens to my profile down the bottom corner?
You use pixels for the positioning, so the pixels always stay the same no matter if the font size changed.
Yeah, I've
And you
used.
use M for the positioning values. And the M, when the font size changed, then it always would have moved around because you used pixels. The pixels stay the same size.
I guess, look, in situations where you have relative and absolute, something's got to set the depth of the parent container. That's the relative elements.
Because the fixed ones moved out of the document flow, had there been a footer element underneath, you could possibly get a situation where the footer element might slide up underneath the actual position, sorry, the absolutely positioned image, but that hasn't occurred in this case.
No, I mean, you would use these things sparingly and sensibly. I'm not suggesting that this is going to be a, you know, a blueprint for making any piece of content look sexy, but hopefully it goes to show that just using a small amount of markup, you can transform things into things that, you know, look pretty cool without using, you know, without really going to town on anything that's particularly complicated. Here, again, I've used some pseudo classes. So I'm actually using a hover pseudo class. If I hover over Collie, his image, I'm actually then changing the opacity of all of the content that's inside his list. And the same thing with Dan. So I can flip across. If I drop down, if I click on Gina's, then it's actually going to take me down. I've elected in this case not to change the formatting of that. But it stands up pretty well actually to text size increases. And if you were going to be piling stuff in, if you really didn't know the amount of copy that was going to be coming in because it was coming from a CMS and some other publishing house or whatever, you wouldn't use this technique. But you know, where you can do stuff, then do stuff. Let's just whiz through a few more bits. Let's think about fixed positioning for a sec. We talked about absolute and relative. And the one thing that IE7 has introduced, which I'm really pleased about, is support for fixed positioning. So fixed positioning is a type of absolute positioning. But instead of being positioned in accordance with the context, it's positioned in accordance with the actual browser window itself and fixed. So here I'm actually going to position, I've lost all the contact information just for sake of the example. We're just going to put position fixed onto each of those images. And then, if we scroll the text inside the browser window, those images are going to stay in position. Now again, I can combine this with any of those pseudo class selectors. So again, hover and focus and stuff like that is still working fine. But this is going to change. These images are going to stay fixed in position no matter what I do with scrolling the window. You know, we couldn't really do this type of stuff before, and it does add an extra layer of kind of visual sexiness to things. And again, if you were thinking about another type of application, this might be an e-commerce site where you've got a list of products down one side, and you might have some nice, you know, larger images that you always want to stay persistent over on the right-hand side. And okay, now I want to click on the kettle, so it's going to take me to the kettle. So I won't show you that working because we're going to run out of time. Now, the one thing that I'm not going to cover too much on today, but is of great interest, is when we start layering elements together. Because if we position something, we also gain the capability of being able to stack it. And web design's been really two-dimensional up till now. You know, everything's been laid out in grids, and very little kind of pops out, and certainly very little overlaps. So what we're able to do with a positioned element is to change its vertical position, if you like, in relation to the viewer. Now, in the normal flow, it's always the last element which is in the markup that will appear, in effect, closest to the viewer as they look at the page, unless we use the z-index property to actually start changing that and altering it in any way we like. So wherever we establish a positioning context by adding positioning to an element, we create the ability inside of that element to be able to stack other positioned elements on top of each other. And whenever we create a new positioned context, what we do in effect is we create a new instance of normal flow. And what happens is that we've then got independent stacking orders. So if I've got two list items here, or two elements here, and I'm then changing the visual order, or the vertical order, if these things are overlapping in the top one, I can then restart normal flow inside this one and have a different stacking order. Now, because I've put position relative on each of these containers, And because they may be inside another position context, I can stack these as well. So you can imagine the kind of creative opportunities that we've got, particularly now with transparent PNGs, where we can start having things that really do start to overlap each other and lots of stuff going on. I don't want to spend too much time on that. And then, of course, what we can do is we can put all of these things together. We can start putting all of these pretty simple and already available CSS techniques into one place. So we're going to take something like this. It's a simple division. We have an anchor with an image over on the left, heading, paragraph, add to basket form, and then our checkout div area over on the right. Simple thing to do. There we go, that's just an overview of the markup. Simple thing to do. Take that division and establish it as a positioning context. It could be a list item, it could be whatever we want it to be. Take the image and float it over to here. That's then going to allocate the space for this. And then absolutely position that div over on the right-hand side. So there's no real restriction in terms of being able to actually pop these things together. Now, quite a lot of the time, I was working on a site for another company where somebody else had worked on the CSS, and it was a simple layout where you had, it was quite nicely laid out. It's the help section of this particular site. So over on the right-hand side, you had all of the body text, and then over here, we'd got the heading levels. So it might have said how to return an element, how to return an item, and then a bunch of stuff, and then the next help item. Just that kind of grid-like layout. And the guy just gone float crazy. And he'd floated the headings to one side, and he'd floated every paragraph to the other side, and every paragraph had clear left on it, and then he had to fight and have a clearing element at the bottom of the containing thing. Just gone completely bonkers. Of course, all he needed to do was use relative positioning, perhaps, to that heading, bam it over to one side. And it really cleaned up the CSS quite dramatically. Because one of the problems with floats is the more you use, the more like, do you get that? Do you remember that game, Kaplunk? No? Yeah? It'd be like where you have to pull the little cocktail sticks out, and it would be like that every time you added a float, and then you change one, and then the whole thing fell apart. And we must have spent about 3 days trying on one particular part of the site, trying to figure out what this guy had done. So just by using combinations of things and bringing positioning back into the workflow, I think helps a lot. And just some other examples here. With this particular one, again, similar technique. It's an unordered list. Each one of the list items contains a description and the product form, add to basket form, and these guys at the top. So, back in the day, we might have thought, okay, well, I need a div, or God forbid, a table for each one of these album arts at the top. And then how am I going to create that? Well, this is really simple, because what I can do is I can float. There's the markup, nicely marked up with micro formats. What I can do is I can apply position relative to the unordered list itself, and now stick 360 pixels worth of top padding right at the top. And that's going to kind of bulldoze a load of space at the top of this unordered list to allow me then to position those images in a minute. So it's going to clear all of this space here. And then what I can do is to float each one of the list items. I've given them particular dimensions. I've chosen pixels, but of course you might choose ems if you wanted to make the thing a lot more flexible. Given it some margins, taken each one of the headings, and then moved it out of the normal flow. So what I've done is I've moved it up into here, but because I want to move the image and its little text description, I've moved all of the heading up there, and I've added a padding top on that H3. Notice here that it's positioned. I've moved it up. But because it's positioned, and obviously I've been able to add it into a nice grid format, because it's positioned, the heading, up at the top of the page, that then becomes a positioning context for other stuff that sits inside it. So we end up with this kind of nested positioning idea. And then I've just taken the image, bearing in mind that I've added padding top to it. I've taken the image and absolutely positioned that up at the top of the heading. And that's what we end up with. So again, different combinations of floats and positioning techniques, and adding the things together and nesting them up together can make for some really interesting results, particularly if you start to then add things like hover and active and target pseudo classes to things, just to give the thing a little bit of life. So, has anybody got any questions, comments, stuff to throw? Gentleman at the back.
Yeah, just a general kind of comment about, I guess, throwing caution in with IE6. I mean, we'd all love to do it, but in a large organisation with a very strong marketing department, they want it to look the same in something like IE6. To them, it's a very important issue. I guess politically, that's a battle that, for instance, where I work, has to fight all the time.
Yeah.
We do have to become educators. I guess it's more of a statement than sort of inviting comment, I suppose, on how one might approach that educational process.
Well, there's no easy answer to that, is there? I mean, it's all very well for me running my own business to say, I'm going to work with clients who accept the way I work, or they can bugger off. You know, I'm in the fortunate position of being able to do that. If you're working inside a large organisation, then yeah, it becomes difficult. I'm not one to. We don't get paid enough to start becoming educators. I mean, you know, we think about these things, and you know, we want to make policy. We know that it's the right thing, but we don't get paid enough to make policy. You know, if it's our managers generally who know much less than we do that make these kind of decisions, and it's ill-informed and ill-educated people that make those kind of decisions that make our life a misery. So sometimes you just got to go c'est la vie. But I think in general, it's the direction that I think we ought to be going. But it must be, I'm so glad that I don't work in a cube in Cupertino, because I think that I would slash my wrists in about a week and a half.
I'll elaborate further. One of the...
Spill it out. Come on, we're all listening.
Interestingly enough, in my Facebook thing, I sort of comment there on my current status as a Remainer. You know, I'm over the politics and all that kind of stuff in a large organisation. But I guess one of the issues is even in the marketing department, they have no control over even updating their browsers. There's another department that's in charge of that. So they can't even see it on a recent browser after 80%. That's the kind of embedded sort of unity, I guess. No, it's used, yes.
See,
Just down the road.
working on the web's shite, really, isn't it?
So you know what you want, but it's almost impossible to achieve because you don't have the political clout.
Yeah, and it's not your job either. If they paid you $250,000 a year, you might have something to do with it. But they'll bring in external consultants that will paint the photocopier red on each floor just to make it easier to find for those. Anyway. I remember this thing, I went to see this client, they had this business consultant brought in by the Welsh National Assembly, which my dog knows a much more about running a country than they do. But anyway, this business consultant came in, and you know, the key message for the day was he had all the workers running around sticking names on the side of each machine, so that they could, you know, it would speed things up by calling that one Doris. I know, don't ask me. I was only building their website. But no, I mean, there's a lot of crap, isn't there? Really. I mean, if you think it's a really imperfect industry to be in, and it's incredibly frustrating. And I'm just very glad that I don't have to usually deal with stuff that you have to deal with. And it's a real wake up though, because I go around doing stuff like this, and people go, yeah, but in our department, you know. And it's true, and I'm so glad. I learned such a lot about how wrong the world is that I just wanted to give up. No, I mean, large organisations that make shiny computers, they want everything to be perfect. And they make decisions that, you know, personally, I don't think any of us would agree with, like the fact that the default text size is the default text size, and that they don't allow any flexibility in terms of design, and they don't even allow for designs of one step up. Now, we all know that's madness, but, you know, brand managers don't understand, potentially, that the brand extends anything beyond the visual look. The fact that it might be a better brand experience if people could increase the size of their text without the layout falling apart, they don't maybe consider that's part of the brand. And from a technical point of view, you know, getting people to understand the differences in browsers and stuff like that. I mean, I actually said to one person at one point, what sort of car have you got? And she said it's a, I don't know, Ford Focus. I said, what does it take? She's like, unleaded. I said, well, go and put some diesel in it and see how far you get. You know, it's a different car, it's a different thing. And it drives me nuts. Yes, darling. That'll be you.
I think, and this is only from my own experience working in education, and part of it is actually putting the focus back on the user and doing some really obvious things like telling them what browser they're using. And even in your black and white I6 example, you showed a, you know, you told them the browser was out of date. I think letting them know that rather than saying, you know, because the first thing they're going to do is say the site's broken if you're not designing for that particular web browser. But letting them know what browser they're on and that they can fix the problem by updating the browser. Yes, it doesn't get around firewalls and teachers who can't download new browsers and update their browsers, but at least it gives them something to report back to their IT services.
But if I wasn't such an Apple geek, and I wasn't hanging on Apple sites or hanging sadly around Apple stores on a Saturday afternoon, I wouldn't know that there was anything wrong with my Nano. My Nano still works.
No, that's what I'm saying. If you put it up front to them and it's up front on your website to say that, you know.
But if Apple, for example, to stretch this analogy far beyond where it ought to go, if Apple all of a sudden started selling music on the iTunes store in a format that my Nano didn't work with, that would be a different issue. That's not what I'm talking about. If they said in order to access this song, you have to have the new Nano, then I would be very cross. But the fact is I can play any old music on my Nano, I just don't play video. And it still does everything that it always did in exactly the same way. You're not talking about wiping anybody out.
No.
The fact is that it's about the visual view. We're not talking about excluding people from content. We're not talking about giving them something that's broken. We're just saying you may not get the same visual result.
I was purely providing a suggestion for people who work with users who are in those situations in institutions where they don't have any control, giving them back some control to be able to go to their IT support and say what they need.
Yeah.
So they're going to go to their IT support saying, hey, I can't see any site in red. You know, could you give me a new browser?
No, that's yeah.
Okay.
I think that needs to be
This is going to turn into those like long pub conversations, isn't it? Okay. It is a problem, and I have no advice or particular solutions.
We've still got people using Windows 3.11. It's only like
Buy the computer.
0.510. It's people who
Okay, but those people,
don't want to buy the latest equipment.
but that's fine with them. That's fine because their computer that they're using from 5 years ago still does all the things that it did 5 years ago. Now that's fine, except that if I want to run the latest version of Office something, it ain't going to run on that computer. But the actual machine itself is still doing its job.
Absolutely, and we still put boardroom video up and stuff like that, and they know that if they want to be able to get that stuff, they'll have to go
The one thing not to do, yeah, the one thing not to do is best viewed in. Yeah, because now we are going to do, and this is one of the issues with iPhone, is that people have been publishing and creating sites with content specifically for iPhone, but actually locking desktop browsers out. And Eric Meyer again was talking about this. This is not what we want to do. You might want to provide an enhanced experience. You might want to detect whether it's an iPhone and then throw up a different type of CSS display for it. That's fine, but let's not lock anybody out. That conversation, this whole IE conversation is going to go on. So should we do some other cool stuff? What time is it? 3. What time did we started back at 1:30, so we've got until now. We've got until 3. Right, let's take a break and head back here. I think it's a half an hour break.